what entity in society doesn't borrow more once it's taking in more revenue? And so they're thinking that the debt is the problem as opposed to just the extraction in the first place. But they say we can fix the problem by raising more revenue, getting more revenue to the U.S. Treasury. It's just unbelievable. So, yeah, in a sense, the delusions are endless. I call it the deficit delusion.
You're listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, where you get valuable information you just can't find anywhere else. To thrive in today's trying times, you need the Financial Survival Network, now more than ever. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and get your free newsletter and gift. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.
And welcome. You are listening to and watching the Financial Survival Network. I'm your host, Kerry Lutz. John Tamny is with us now. He runs Real Clear Markets, author of a new book, which we'll be talking about, called Deficit Delusion. Delusions?
Delusion.
Delusion. Okay, but there are multiple delusions out there, no doubt. There's no shortage of delusions in our modern world here. I know John, John, you and I, we spoke, did a few interviews with you way back in 2012, 2011. The world's changed quite a bit since then. But hey, let's talk about deficit delusion or delusions first. What is the biggest delusion about the deficit?
That the crisis is ahead. All left, right, and supply side talk about is, well, it could get really bad, and we better. They're eventually they're going to not be so kind to us, the rest of the world, and that's the crisis. And I'm thinking, have you guys lost your minds? The crisis is not a future thing. It's not a future when lenders decide that they don't want to lend to the United States anymore. That's kind of a good thing when people cut off government. The crisis is in the here and now. I mean, it's unseen, but it's in how much more advanced we'd be if government weren't consuming so much in the way of precious resources. It's in what the grandchildren inherit. The left, right, and supply side, they say, well, yeah, they're going to inherit all this debt. That's so awful, and we're having a good time at the expense of them. Where's the good time in government spending? It's a bad time. It's the central planning of precious resources. So that's the crisis, but you can't see it because you don't see how much more advanced we'd be without it. The burden for the grandchildren is that we leave them a much less evolved world. And even more challenging, we leave them a much bigger government. This focus on the debt is just so childish, and it worse in saying that the crisis in the future. It's these different economic religions basically saying, yeah, markets are incredibly stupid. They can't see what we can all see. They can't see the crisis that's ahead. I mean, it's just mindless.
I totally agree with you because every dollar that the government spends, it's taken from the people, from the businesses that could arguably be spent a lot more efficiently. And, you're right. The crisis has been ongoing, arguably since FDR. And when the country really ran off the rails, when personal responsibility took a backseat to government largesse. And yes, like, we can point to the Hoover Dam. We can point to a lot of bridges and tunnels that were built. But we could also point to a lot of post offices that were built that are basically houses for human non-productivity.
It's also true. I like how you put it, houses for human non-productivity. I would throw into that one of the things that someday I'd like to raise money for is the Museum of the Unseen. And literally take it around the country, and I think you can get good publicity for it, and just people show up and there's nothing in there. And that's kind of the point. It's what we're not doing. Yet, no matter the economic religion, it's always a future problem. And so they focus on balanced budgets as though that matters. No, what matters is how much they extract. To balance the budget in the United States, it's the accomplishment equivalent of slam dunking on a 6-foot basket if you're 7 feet tall. I mean, you're extracting from the most productive people on earth. Balanced budget misses the point. It's about how much they extract every year, and they extract too much from us. That's why we have so much debt. I've never heard of an entity that can borrow so much unless it's taking so much in the first place, such that people trust the debt. Yet left, right, and supply side keep talking about how, no, we need to fix the debt problem. We need to raise more revenue. I mean, have they lost their minds? What entity in society doesn't borrow more once it's taking in more revenue? And so they're thinking that the debt is the problem as opposed to just the extraction in the first place. But they say we can fix the problem by raising more revenue, getting more revenue to the U.S. Treasury. It's just unbelievable. So, yeah, in a sense, the delusions are endless. I call it the deficit delusion.
Yeah, so true, because it's a symptom of out-of-control government. So I just wrote an article because I know this case is coming. I don't know how it's going to come to the Supreme Court, and that is the impoundment, the ICA, Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which basically, and I gave this example, if Congress decides that they want to create a monument to basically the tomb of the faceless bureaucrat, and in honor of them screwing up our lives, messing up, failing to grant permits, all this, and then they're going to have a bonfire that runs 24/7, and they're going to feed it with freshly minted $100 bills from the Federal Reserve, and they mandate that this bonfire must be kept going 24/7 in perpetuity. Under the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, the president's required to light the match. I mean, it's absurd, but that case is coming. And that case, if we have somebody who actually wants to cut government spending and cut the scale of it back, it's going to go in favor of the president. We'll see what he does with that newfound power.
Well, the only thing I would say, though, in response to you is that, so what? I mean, I'm not making a comment on whether it's constitutional or not. I'm just saying, cut spending. That's not going to shrink government, and it's not going to shrink government. It's like if you spend less, there's not less consumption in society. You're just, what you don't spend is shifted to someone else through whatever financial intermediaries you use. Mm-hmm. When governments don't spend, or when they shrink a program, the money doesn't disappear. It just goes to something else. And so I make the argument in the book. I reject your point that we have out of control government. No, what we have is a government that takes in too much revenue. And because it takes in too much revenue, it can borrow with ease, and it can borrow in enormous amounts because markets are a look into the future, as we both agree. The markets know that the revenue is going to grow, grow, and grow. And so the problem is overtaxation of Americans. That people would spend the gobs of money that flow to them is a statement of the obvious. But if you cut spending, if we just cut, if Doge can just get $2 trillion out of, that would just free up $2 trillion for them to dream up new, really awful ideas with. The problem is too much revenue.
And the problem is that the system, Congress totally in charge of spending money. And the president has no say over it whatsoever under that ICA Act. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying
even if he did.
If he did, and if he wanted to change it, then he could. But if he doesn't have control and he does want to change it, he has no power. If he has control and he doesn't want to change anything, then nothing is going to change. But look, they've already violated that act numerous times, like hundreds of times with Doge. And I'm not saying it's the cure-all for the court to rule it unconstitutional, but if we do get a president who wants to cut spending, and I'm not convinced that the current occupant is the one to do that, then at least he might have the tools to do it. Don't forget, the last impeachment of Trump was brought under the Impoundment Control Act when they said he didn't send the money to Ukraine. That was part of the basis for that. he didn't spend the money that they told him to spend, and that was somehow a high crime and a misdemeanor.
No, look, I like it until I'm reminded of, let's say we cut spending, we haven't cut the flow of revenue into the government. So even if you could shrink spending for a year or two, it wouldn't change anything. The problem is too much revenue now and way too much.
That's part of it. It's all interconnected, and it's all being stolen here, John. Let's face it. They call it fraud, abuse, waste. I call it theft. All right? Theft that comes in the form of a 1040 tax return.
Yeah, it's a tough one because the government is us. We allowed this to happen, and so it's hard for me to say it's theft when we keep voting for it. But I think we have similar goals here. I think we recognize something similar, that the crisis is in the advances that are not happening, and it's not even a question of arguably less efficient. Of course, government spending is less efficient. And because it's such a size consumer of precious wealth, we always have to wonder what we're not achieving as a consequence.
And that is the real crime here, because you and I agree on this 100%. If government had stayed at the level it was at before Roosevelt, right, or even if it had gone up slightly from there, the amount of wealth that this country would possess would just be astounding. It would far exceed any other, even the United States, pre-World War I, because every dollar that the government spends is a lost opportunity for the person that's paying it, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're so right. And I think it's important the way that you describe it. Again, think of how left, right, and supply side do it. It's always, well, we better do this because the crisis may happen. They've never sold anything in their lives. I mean, I can't think of a more loser approach, unpersuasive approach, because people can say, well, yeah, you've been saying that forever, and it never comes true. But it should be an optimistic sale, and that, gosh, think of what we could be doing. Think of as prosperous as we are, and we're the richest country on earth. We're amazing. Think how much more prosperous, more advanced we would be. The present, if we were at levels from the 1930s, it would make the present look Bangladesh by comparison. We're nowhere close to what we could achieve.
Yeah, that is the crime, and unfortunately, it's a silent crime.
Yeah, it's unseen. We don't know.
No one knows it, what we could have been had the government not metastasized into its current form. So let's talk about something, though, because we were talking about a pre-call. Your attitude towards your own life, really, whether you're optimistic towards your own life or pessimistic, is going to carry over to your attitude towards what you expect the government to be. And I remember there was a guy, Howard Schultz, I think his name was. He wrote a newsletter called The One-Armed Economist after something FDR once said. And he basically said, when we have a depression, it's really massive mental depression on the part of the population. The majority just get very pessimistic, and then the economy follows suit. So is this a chicken and egg situation here, John, or is there something to this?
Okay, so I don't think I would have to convince you that what drives economic growth isn't consumption, it's savings, as in entrepreneurs and savings. Yeah, nothing new to you there. And so there's always been this belief out there that, well, the media can talk us into a recession. They'll tell us that things are going to get bad, and economists say, well, yeah, then people will stop spending, and oh boy, the economy is going to be desperate. But as you and I know, it's the lack of spending that feeds new ideas. That's not to say that people won't consume. We're wired to consume. That's the easy part. But if we're spending less, that just frees up capital more for businesses and new ideas.
Absolutely.
And so I've always felt that recessions are self-correcting in that way for reasons beyond. If people are really worried, A, they're fixing what they're doing wrong. Recessions signal the recovery. but they also signal the recovery in that, okay, I'm going to pull back for a time. I'm nervous about what's ahead. I'm going to pull back, and that kind of that builds up the capital base for recovery. And so I don't think mental can drive depressions, but I think what you and I were talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, you and I think that people's perception of the world around them is driven, perception of the future is driven by their own situation. And I think you're absolutely right. I think someone who has a great day, if you ask them where things are headed, they would have a fully different view than if they'd had a horrible day or a horrible year or month. Or
you just made me think of that song, Everything's Coming Up Roses, you know? Mm-hmm. Gypsy Lee Russell, you know, one of those Rodgers and Hammerstein plays. You know, when you're feeling good, the world looks good. When you're feeling bad, you're imagining the worst around every corner. So because your own economy starts in your brain, and you have to control your state and not get sucked in, because, you know, there is a lot of negativity out there. There are problems for sure. But John, look, like the way we live, not just in the United States, but in Europe and in the more developed parts of the world, there's never been anything like this before, where literally in many ways you live better than the kings of yesteryear.
No doubt. Living standards are amazing. They're an effect of innovative people mass producing goods that past generations never imagined they could have. And, you know, I think you hit on something else that's really important. What's that line from Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson? He said, quote, "What is harmful or disastrous to an individual must be equally harmful or disastrous to the collection of individuals that make up a nation." And all he was saying, but I thought it was the most important line in the book that no one talks about, they never talk about. He's just saying economies are individuals, as you allude, and as you state. And so, but this is important when we consider policy. I don't care what your ideology is. No individual's economy is improved if they're handing more and more of the wealth over to the government. If they're spending more time dealing with regulators rather than producing whatever it is they're producing. If they're not allowed to trade with other people who want to trade with them in other parts of the world. Economic growth and optimism is fairly basic once you break it down to these first principles that you've broken down to, that it's individuals. And individuals are much more collectively depressed when policy is suffocating their ability to help themselves as individuals.
Yeah, but, you know, the problem, it's kind of like education. You know, going back, I grew up in the 60s. More than half the population smoked cigarettes, which is an absolute act of insanity. Self-destructive. It's maybe not going to get you now, but maybe in 10 years, maybe in 20, eventually it's going to get you. Now, I never thought I'd live to see the day where less than 20% of the population smokes tobacco, cigarettes, and that number keeps falling. And, you know, the left is always saying education, education. But this is a case where education really worked. So why can't we have economic education and personal finance education? Because we've proven that society as a whole can actually change their attitudes, their behavior. And, you know, I can't say about what they're eating there as far as processed foods, but at least they're not smoking cigarettes and taking 10, 20, 30 years off their lifespan like they once were.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. I loved smoking when I smoked, but I get your point. I guess my point there is that we didn't need education for that. We knew, and people knew. People knew. They knew. You tell when you're a smoker, you know how you feel.
Yeah.
But there's joy in it, and so people do things. You know, I don't bungee jump. Some people bungee jump. I like to smoke. I didn't wear masks during the lockdowns. That didn't fear me, but it scared some people. So, you know,
wear a mask. Yeah. That's your thing. Wear 2 or 3. Who cares?
Yeah, you know, let people figure it out. They'll figure it out by watching it. And including if the lack of masks was killing people, people would start wearing masks if that was the difference between sickness or death. Education, I just think people get it. You know, People say, well, the pessimists in our midst, they say, oh, well, things are so bad. And I think, well, in the 1970s, the Civil Aeronautics Board centrally planned airlines that were created to move mail around. I remember in the 1970s, and I know you did, odd and even days for gasoline and waiting long lines for gasoline because both sides bought into price controls.
Yeah.
I remember that you couldn't own a phone back then. You had to rent it from the government's preferred monopoly.
Yeah, $2 a month.
It was talk about taxation. The top rate was 70%, and Ronald Reagan was ridiculed not just by Democrats, but by Republicans for having the temerity to say that we should lower the rate. They said it'd cause inflation. And probably the dumbest one of them all was the CIA, and most of the economists at the CIA, but economists in general, they all say, well, the Soviet Union is just a different economic system, but theirs is almost as large as ours. Yeah. Don't tell me that we haven't improved. Don't tell me things aren't better, that people aren't more knowledgeable. None of those ideas would last a second in any economic discussion today. We're much smarter, not because of school. Again, the conservatives, oh my gosh, they're socialists. Oh, these Democrats, oh my God. People figure it out. Mm-hmm. We're not babies. We can look around. We know what works.
Yeah, well, I'm surprised. I've been an Austrian economist or devotee of the Austrian school since I'm 20 years old. So going on close to 50 years. And what amazes me is people actually understand the concept that when you print money and it's not backed up by increases in productivity, that you get this thing called inflation. It surprises me how knowledgeable much of the public's become about that. So, but education in that, yes, everybody knew cigarettes were bad for you, but they didn't know exactly how bad they were. I think, I don't feel as good, but, I think the information was hidden from plain sight. But now I think education, as far as economics goes, it's all Keynesian, it's all kind of Keynesian brainwashing. And I think the public is repudiating that now.
Are they? I've always argued that monetarism, that's just another sturdy leg of the Keynesian chair. No offense. I think Austrians in many ways are a variation of Keynesianism. They imagine that central banks can just produce excess credit. Now, credit's produced in the private economy. So Keynesians say that government spending drives growth, and so too much government spending causes inflation. Oh, please, governments can't spend what they have taken from us. You've already explained that.
Sure.
Money that circulates because of production. Forget about money printing and all this. If you go to Venezuela right now, you go to Iran, you go to Pyongyang, if you want to buy things, you better have dollars because no one's going to take the local currency.
Correct.
And so I say this as a way of saying money that's trusted, reasonably trusted. Now, probably you and I, in our perfect world, the dollar would have a stable definition. I'd love to have it. But the dollar circulates globally, not because the Fed put it there, but because where there's production, there's money. But then you have the Austrians saying that somehow, the Fed can just create excess credit. No, it cannot. As Mises was clear, we borrow money for what it can be exchanged for. And so the Fed can't create credit. Only the private sector can create credit. And so if the Fed tried to print money or whatever, this wacko stuff, the dollar would cease circulating. It doesn't, markets are smart, and no one's going to take a currency that was, quote, printed because they're going to say, well, I won't get back as much as I brought to market for that currency. And so I just think I think all the religions need to wake up and say that people are smart and they see through all this stuff.
Yeah. Well, a lot of countries, every fiat currency out there has done the same thing and eventually realized their intrinsic value. The dollar is the one that has lasted the longest since it became fiat. It's 54 years now. So the experiment is ongoing, and but the idea of a stable currency, the banks don't like it, right? Yes.
Oh, I think they would love it.
You think so? But then their loans become worth more, but
Yes.
harder to pay back.
Why would they be harder to pay back? With a stable currency, you'd have all this investment removed from inflation hedges and hard assets representing existing wealth, and you could much more capably put it to work in new ideas. Let's never forget that the dollar fell substantially in the 2000s. I don't think it's unrelated that various U.S. banks and investment banks were brought to their knees by this massive devaluation. Contrast that with the 80s and 90s. Ronald Reagan didn't get it, but he ran on returning to a gold standard. Markets saw ahead and responded to that. Gold collapsed during the Reagan years. Never forget that Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin, was big about a strong, stable dollar. Is it any surprise that Wall Street's golden years were during those years? Wall Street hates chaos. It makes a lot more money from investment banking than it does from trading. That's precisely why Jamie Dimon, once he took over at J.P. Morgan, got rid of all the prop desks, because he knew that investors wouldn't pay for trading profits. There's no money in that. Banks would be much better off with good money.
Yeah, they might be, but they are a beneficiary of inflation because the new money that's created, they get it first before it's appreciated.
No. Again, if that were true, why did they nearly die in the 2000s? Why was Wall Street on its knees in the 70s? Inflation's bad. Banks lend out money hoping to get something back. Inflation wipes out the value of their loans. Come on, you know that.
Well, yeah, that's why everything's adjustable now, but that doesn't really address the underlying problem that the dollars they're getting paid back are worth less than the dollars they loaned out.
Yeah, no, well, it goes up and down. There are stages where the dollar is stronger. We haven't seen that in the 21st century. I'll go to my grave saying that George W. Bush was easily the worst president in my lifetime, and one of the most awful of many things he did that no one will ever talk about, because no one talks about money anymore, is that he reversed the Reagan-Clinton era of a strong, stable dollar. His Treasury secretaries from Paul O'Neill on kept saying, hey, what's the importance of a strong dollar? Well, it's of utmost importance. It's the most important current price in the world. Yep. And the Bush administration oversaw a major devaluation. And it's no surprise from that where we went.
To boost exports.
It's the dumbest thing.
It doesn't work. All right, John, so tell me, where do we find you? How do we connect with you on the web?
Oh, you could go to Twitter or X, I suppose. I'm on there. I'm still editor of Real Clear Markets, and I put out at least one column every day, trying to convince people to think as I do. Not very successfully, but, you only have to, as I always remind people, if you can even change thinking a little, that represents big progress. And so there's all my books that everyone listening or watching should buy several copies of. Number 8, The Deficit Delusion, comes out in August.
I'm ordering it. I pre-order on Amazon, and I guess it'll be available at Amazon and wherever fine books used to be sold, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'd like to say that it's going to be in bookstores everywhere, but I don't trust my sales history. So, but Amazon for sure.
Yeah. All right. Hey, it's great to talk to you again. Great to connect. And if you've got a question for John, myself, shoot me an email, kl@kerrylutz.com. All of John's info will be in the show notes of this interview on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. When you go there, just ask that you please sign up for your free newsletter, like over 75,000 of you have already. John, great connecting with you. We'll talk to you again real soon.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on your big viewership.
Thanks for listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, your solution to today's trying times. For the latest, go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.